So chapter 14 covers infection, a lot of terminology that go along with that, infectious disease, and epidemiology. With the coronavirus pandemic, we've all had a bit of a crash course, I would say, in some of the epidemiology, so you will probably recognize a lot of those, a lot of the terminology and concepts there. So these are your study objectives. I will break up each lecture segment and correlate it to which study objectives goes with that lecture segment. And then you'll do an online quiz for each lecture segment as before. Okay, so the first thing that I want to explain is something called the reservoirs of infectious disease. And infectious disease can be bacterial, virus, and to a lesser extent fungus, parasites, protozoans. Probably the most notable ones would be the ones that cause the African sleeping sickness and the malaria. But no matter what the pathogen is, it tends to be true that most pathogens cannot survive outside of their host for very long. Now, what very long means depends on which organism it is. So sometimes it's days, sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's minutes, but there must be an organism that hosts the pathogens. And sometimes the host of those pathogens don't get the disease themselves. Sometimes they do. But those are called the reservoirs of infection. So where does the pathogen live on an ongoing basis? Right? It can be outside of the host for an hour or a day, but where does it live on a long-term basis? And that's called the reservoir. And fundamentally, there's three kinds of reservoirs. Animal reservoirs, and by that we mean non-human animals. Then particularly humans as reservoirs, typically carriers that are not symptomatic or don't seem to get the disease, but they can pass it on. And then there are a couple of non-living reservoirs. Typically that's going to be like water, so contaminated water supplies. For example, contaminated food supplies. We've seen E. coli transferred on lettuce. So I guess lettuce is living, but what they mean is non-animal. So a lot of times it's like a contaminated water supply. So let's talk about animal reservoirs. There is a group of diseases, they're called zoonoses, which refers to diseases that can go from animals to humans. Usually, if you get a zoonose type disease, you get it from the animal, either from contact from the animal, even a bite, contact from the animal's wastes in some cases, eating animals that are infected, or in some cases there's a vector that carries the organism from an animal to a human. So mosquitoes as a blood-sucking arthropod, for example. Fleas have served as that vector in the past. And humans are usually what we call dead-end hosts, meaning a zoonotic pathogen goes from an animal reservoir to, one human, and that human might get sick, but they don't pass it to another human. So each individual human case would have to get it from the animal itself. Sometimes that is still a big problem because if you have, for example, fleas that are taking, let's say, the plague. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, but it was transferred from rats and fleas to humans, and the problem was there were a lot of rats and fleas in the living spaces of the populations that got the plague. So, but if we're looking at, situation, in the United States now, those things become less of a threat because we're less likely to have rats in our home. We're less likely to have a flea infestation and rats. And so some of those things become less of a threat. Now, mosquitoes are still a problem, even in the world that we live in the United States. So, depends on what the situation is, how much of a risk that is. But a zoonotic pathogen typically is not passed from human to human. It's passed from animal to human each time a human gets sick. It's hard to eradicate. Eradicate means completely get rid of a disease if there is an animal reservoir. We have found that, the only way you could do it would be to eradicate all those animals. So you'd have to go into the wild and kill off all of the, bats or all of the rats, which is basically impossible. And for ecological reasons, you really don't want to do that. But in any case, it's very hard to get rid of a disease if there's an animal reservoir. So this list you do not need to memorize, but there's some different types of zoonoses. So tapeworm, the animal reservoir is dogs. Fasciola, which are flukes, their animal reservoir is sheep and cattle. Malaria, the animal reservoir, you'll remember that's caused by Plasmodium. Ringworm, domestic animals. Anthrax, bubonic plague, I was mentioning Yersinia pestis, carried by rodents, transmitted by flea bites. So unless you got rid of all these animals, so you'd have to go through the world and just kill all of these, which, we don't want to do. But that would be the only way to get rid of the pathogen that's, tends to be in those animals. So these are some of your zoonoses, but you don't need to memorize them. Now, what about humans? Humans can be a reservoir, and that's something we're seeing with the coronavirus. For some reason, some people get no symptoms. They get an infection, and we'll define what that means. So in the coronavirus example, the virus is replicating, is reproducing inside these individuals, but they don't have any pathology. They don't have any dysfunction or symptoms, is what we would call them, signs and symptoms. So nobody knows that they have it, but they can be passing the virus to people they come in contact with. And we don't know why some people get very sick and some people don't. This is a pretty common scenario, though, not just for coronavirus, but for other things. So humans can be the reservoir for certain diseases. And like I was saying before, what we call non-living reservoirs include soil, water, and the food supply. So these can be reservoirs of infection, especially like a contaminated water supply. If you have a population that doesn't have proper sanitation of sewage and they don't have proper purification of their water, then what happens typically is the sewage gets dumped into the water supply, and then people are drinking basically sewage, and that can spread an infectious agent very quickly. So in history, we see a lot of that. Okay, let's define a couple terms: contamination versus infection. So let's say I go out into the world and I touch things and I get microbes on me. Then I'm contaminated. You're contaminated all the time by something. Some of them are not harmful, but you're contaminated by microbes all the time. Usually we call them like transient microbes. It washes off in the shower. If the organism actually gets into your body, so past the skin, past the gets through a portal, what we usually call a portal, if it gets into your body and it actually starts to multiply, then that's infection. So contamination is just you got some of it on you, but it's not doing anything, and it didn't get past your outer surface. But when it gets into your body and starts multiplying, then you have an infection. So these are the portals. They show a female here just because there are some portals related to pregnancy. But these would be the same for male except for the fetus. So you have these mucous membranes, basically the lining inside all of your openings. So eye, nose, mouth, those are openings, ear, and anus, vagina, urethra. So, and if in males, urethra, and for a pregnant female, the placenta can be an entry point for pathogens to reach the fetus. And then the other thing would be any break in the skin. An insect bite or a cut allows something to get across the skin. The skin is a very good barrier, so you would have to have a cut or some kind of break like a bite. Other than that, it's going to have to get in through one of these other portals where the mucous membranes are. So that's why you don't want to rub your eye with dirty hands. You don't want to rub your mouth. You don't want to, I don't know if much goes in through the ear, but let's say, I guess it's a possibility. But mouth, nose, and eyes are going to be pretty major points of entry for some things. And then cuts in the skin. So these are called portals of entry. So that's how bacteria, that's how virus, any other organism, Plasmodium is a protozoan, can come in through an insect bite. So that's how they get past your first line of defense, which is your skin. All right, so these are some pathogens that cross the placenta. You don't need to memorize these, but the point is that we do have, a pregnant woman has special concerns because some things that would not be harmful for an adult, for example, cytomegalovirus, pretty asymptomatic for an adult person, but very dangerous for the embryo or fetus. So some things that are not that dangerous for an adult or moderately dangerous become deadly for a fetus. So pregnant women have special concerns. They're kind of in that group of individuals that have to be considered a little bit differently than your typical adult. So how do microbes really start creating the infection? The infection is really the replication, the reproduction of the pathogen. Of course, you know that if it's a virus, it has to attach to a host cell and then enter the host cell. So we talked in chapter 13 about different ways that viruses can enter host cells. If it's another type of microbe, a lot of times with bacteria, the bacterium likes to attach to something. Not that it's going to enter a host cell, but it needs to attach to something. It likes to feel attached. It likes to feel secure before it starts dividing. And so sometimes we talk about that as an adhesion. And a lot of bacteria have these different adhesion factors. Those can be things on the outer surface. They could be a slime layer. But there are something that causes it to be able to attach to a surface or to a tissue, and that a lot of times will stimulate the reproductive process of that pathogen. Now, like I said, infection is when you have the organism is replicating, reproducing inside the body. But some infections don't cause disease. In other words, you might have an infection and you don't even know it. So you have something replicating inside your body, but you don't know it. Disease is when something is wrong. So we define it as the pathogen alters normal body function. Something is off. And so you can be infected and not have disease. So let's back that up a little bit. You can be contaminated and not get infected. You know, when you wash your hands, you're getting rid of anything that's contaminating your hands. But if you get infected, then you might not get the disease, because the disease is when there's something wrong, some kind of problem that you're having. So the manifestations, the way we know that you have a disease is you feel bad. You have either symptoms or signs. A lot of times we just say symptoms, but we're going to get a little technical, and we're going to differentiate between these two terms, symptoms and signs. A symptom, technically speaking, is a subjective characteristic of the disease that only the patient can tell you about. There's no way to measure it. If I say I'm nauseated or my stomach's upset, you have to take me at my word. There's no way that you could measure that. But a sign would be something that you could measure. If I have a fever, you could take my temperature and confirm that I have a fever. So a fever is measurable, but a symptom is subjective. It's just something the patient tells you is wrong, how they feel. And I find as a patient that my doctor puts a lot more trust in signs. So I guess I understand it, because he has to go with the, what he can actually confirm. But sometimes I feel terrible, but I'm just not running a fever. So it's tricky, I think, when you're a healthcare provider. But symptoms are things the patient reports. If I say I have a headache, you just have to believe me. We don't have any way of measuring that to confirm it. So signs and symptoms. So here's a list. So symptoms, things the patient says they feel, but you can't really confirm or deny it. Pain, nausea, headache, chills, sore throat. Now you could see like a red throat. That would be more of a sign, something you could actually see. But a sore throat is something you feel. Fatigue, I feel tired. I feel lethargic, itching, cramping. Now, signs, things that you could measure. You could see swelling. You can see rash. If someone's actually vomiting, that would be a sign. Something somebody else can see. So I will tell you that when my children were trying to stay home from school, they would have a lot of symptoms they would tell me about. And I would tell them, well, unless you can come up with basically a sign, unless you can show me a fever, unless you actually throw up, you're going to have to go to school. Now, is that fair? I don't know. But I did kind of know that they were trying to stay home from school sometimes. So anyway, so symptoms versus signs. All right, when they do your blood work, they're measuring blood counts and different levels of proteins in your blood. That's all signs. And a doctor is going to combine signs and symptoms together to make a diagnosis, I would think. But they definitely like to have things that they can measure to go off of. All right, the last part of this lecture segment is going to be this list, terminology of disease. I'm going to circle some of these, not all of them, but a lot of them, to be honest, because the quicker you start to learn some of these roots, the easier it's going to be for you to figure out new words. If you know the roots, it gives you hints as to what the word means. So some of these you're probably going to recognize anyway, but I'm going to circle some. Okay, so let's go with emia, something to do with the blood. So if you have viremia, you have viruses in your blood. If you have bacteremia, you have bacteria in your blood. If you have anemia, I guess technically that means a lack of blood. In that case, it means a lack of red blood cells that are delivering oxygen to your tissues. All right, endo, that's a prefix. That means inside. Gen can be a suffix or a prefix. That means give rise to, or like make or create. So something that causes or creates or makes or becomes. Ideo. Ideo means unknown. Itis means inflammation of. And let's go with patho is abnormal. So a pathogen is something that causes an abnormality in the sense of disease. And let's go with septa, something rotten. So septicemia, something rotten in the blood. Something, rotten or rotting. Your septic tank has something rotten in it, if you have a septic tank. And then let's go with tox. Something poisonous, something toxic, toxin. So let's go with this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You might know some of the other ones that I didn't highlight, but let's go with those 8 as ones that you want to start putting into memory.